The golden light of Cygnus Prime's triple suns filtered through the grand crystalline dome of the conclave chamber, casting fractured rainbows across the assembled delegates. I, Ambassador Loris Vanya of the Neutral Federation of Xylos, observed the proceedings with the practiced detachment cultivated over 3 decades of diplomatic service. Yet even my carefully maintained neutrality felt strained under the weight of what was about to unfold. Emperor Kalen IV sat upon his elevated throne, a technological marvel of ancient design that hovered 3 meters above the polished obsidian floor. The throne itself was an ostentatious display of power, a masterwork of precious metals and rare materials from 100 conquered worlds, each element deliberately chosen to represent the sublime dominance of the galactic hegemony. The Emperor himself, a withered figure whose life had been artificially extended well beyond natural limits, was almost lost within the grandeur of his seat. Only his eyes, sharp, calculating, and utterly devoid of compassion, betrayed the ruthless intelligence that had maintained his iron grip across 17 galactic sectors for over 2 centuries. Around him, arranged in concentric circles according to their standing within the hegemony's rigid hierarchy, sat the representatives of 1,000 worlds. The inner circles gleamed with the opulence of the privileged core worlds, those ancient allies whose early submission to Kalen's ancestors had earned them positions of favor. Their delegates were adorned in ceremonial regalia that rivaled the Emperor's own display, though careful never to outshine it. As one moved outward through the circles, the splendor diminished proportionally to distance from power. The middle rim delegates maintained dignity in their simpler attire, while those of the outer sectors, including the recently incorporated Terran colonies, were relegated to austere seating at the chamber's periphery. Even from my neutral observation platform, I could sense the simmering resentment emanating from these outer representatives, whose worlds bore the heaviest taxation while receiving the least benefit from their membership in the hegemony. Governor Valerius, commander of the hegemony's military forces, stood at the Emperor's right hand. His massive frame was encased in ceremonial battle armor, its surface inlaid with honors from 100 campaigns of conquest and suppression. His face, square-jawed and scarred, maintained the perpetual sneer of one accustomed to instant obedience. I had encountered Valerius on several diplomatic missions in the past, and each time found myself repulsed by his particular blend of arrogance and calculated brutality. The conclave had been proceeding according to its rigorously prescribed ritual. Minor trade disputes had been arbitrated, planetary governors confirmed, and ceremonial tributes presented. The atmosphere, though superficially cordial, crackled with undercurrents of tension. Reports of unrest in the outer sectors had increased in recent months, particularly among the Terran colonies, whose technological prowess and stubborn independence had made their assimilation into the hegemony far more problematic than anticipated. When the Emperor raised a bejeweled hand, the chamber fell into immediate silence. His voice, artificially amplified, echoed throughout the vast space with unnerving clarity. Today, we address concerns of security and unity within our glorious hegemony. He began, the archaic formality of his speech a reminder of his centuries-long rule. Our intelligence services have uncovered disturbing evidence of sedition and technological sabotage originating from the outer sectors, particularly the Terran colonies. I noticed the Terran representative, or rather, the empty seat where the representative should have been. Ambassador Chun had been conspicuously absent for 3 consecutive sessions, his whereabouts a subject to concerned whispers among the neutral delegations. The Emperor continued, in response to these threats, and to safeguard the peace and prosperity we have maintained for centuries, I hereby enact the Unification Decree. A collective intake of breath swept through the chamber. The Unification Decree was not entirely unexpected. Rumors had circulated for months, but its formal announcement was nonetheless shocking. This decree, the Emperor pronounced, will standardize governance across all sectors, centralizing resource allocation and security operations under direct imperial control. All planetary defense systems will be integrated with the hegemony network. All proprietary technologies will be registered and licensed through the Imperial Authority. All autonomous governance structures will be replaced with Imperial governors. The implications were unmistakable. The limited autonomy that Outer Worlds had maintained was to be stripped away entirely. Their resources would be directly controlled by the Empire, their technologies confiscated, their self-governance abolished. The decree was nothing less than Imperial annexation disguised as a security measure. A brave delegate from one of the affected systems, a Syrian, judging by her iridescent skin, rose to voice objection. Your Imperial Majesty, this decree violates the foundational treaties under which our worlds joined the hegemony. We have rights of. Governor Valerius stepped forward, his hand casually resting on his ceremonial weapon. The Empire's security supersedes all prior arrangements, he interrupted. We have evidence of Terran design technologies being deployed to undermine Imperial systems. These measures are necessary and not subject to debate. The Syrian delegate faltered, then slowly resumed her seat. No others rose to speak. The silent defeat that permeated the chamber was almost tangible. The collective recognition that protest was both futile and potentially dangerous. As the Emperor began elaborating on implementation timelines, a distant commotion became audible from the grand corridor leading to the chamber. The perfect choreography of the conclave faltered as heads turned toward the massive entrance doors. Even the Emperor paused, his ancient features displaying the faintest trace of annoyance at the disruption. The disturbance grew louder. Guards stationed at the entrance moved to investigate, their communications devices suddenly emitting static. The chamber's ambient lighting flickered momentarily, and the sophisticated holographic displays that had been projecting data about the unification decree sputtered and died. Then the doors burst open. A single figure staggered through the entrance. Blood, human blood, spattered her torn uniform, which I recognized with shock as that of a Terran military officer. Her dark hair was matted with sweat and grime, her face bearing fresh cuts and the beginnings of bruises. Yet despite her battered appearance, she moved with determined purpose. And behind her, being dragged across the polished floor by a grip on his collar, was the unmistakable form of Governor Valerius. The chamber erupted in gasps and exclamations. I felt my diplomatic mask slip as my jaw literally dropped open in astonishment. The governor, whose battle prowess was legendary, whose advanced armor systems were allegedly impenetrable, was now a limp, semi-conscious form being hauled like refuse by this lone, injured Terran. His once magnificent armor was shattered in multiple places, circuitry exposed and sparking. His face was bloodied, his eyes unfocused. The woman dragged him to the center of the chamber, directly below the Emperor's floating throne, then unceremoniously released him. Valerius crumpled to the floor with a dull thud that echoed in the now silent chamber. The woman straightened, scanning the room with fierce intensity until her gaze locked onto the Emperor himself. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly despite the lack of amplification. I am Captain Eva Rostova, emissary of Earth and its colonies. Your Governor Valerius was captured while attempting to implement your unification decree ahead of schedule, by force, on the Terran colony of New Horizon. Her accent was distinctly Terran, her tone unyielding. He came with a fleet. He intended a demonstration of Imperial power. Instead, we sent it back to you as our demonstration. Imperial guards finally mobilized, moving to surround Rostova with weapons drawn. She appeared utterly unconcerned by their presence. Stop! The Emperor's voice cracked with rage. How dare you violate the sacred proceedings of the Conclave? You'll be executed for this transgression. Rostova's smile was cold. Before you attempt that, you should know that I'm currently linked to a dead man's switch. If my vital signs cease, or if I don't enter a specific code every 30 minutes, the full implementation of what we call the Silence Protocol will activate across all hegemony systems. She gestured toward a portable projection device on her wrist, which activated to display footage that appeared across the chamber's main view screens, screens that should have been impossible to access without Imperial authorization. The footage showed multiple scenes: hegemony warships drifting powerless in space, military installations with systems offline, Imperial garrisons unable to deploy or communicate. Most shockingly, it showed Valerius leading an assault force against what appeared to be a civilian Terran settlement, only to have their weapons, communications, and even their powered armor suddenly deactivate, leaving them vulnerable to the surprisingly well-organized Terran defenders. Your unification decree is based on fabricated security threats, Rostova continued. The real threat to your power isn't sedition or sabotage. It's the simple fact that your empire has grown beyond your ability to control it without resorting to increasingly brutal methods. The Terran colonies refused to surrender our autonomy or our technological innovations. When Valerius came to make an example of New Horizon, we were ready. The Imperial Guards looked uncertainly toward their emperor, awaiting orders that could potentially trigger whatever failsafe Rostova had mentioned. The chamber remained in stunned silence as she continued. I'm here to inform you that your rule, as you've known it, has ended. The choice before you is what comes next. The Emperor's face contorted with rage. Guards, seize her. I will not be threatened in my own conclave. The guards hesitated, looking at the still stunned form of Governor Valerius, living proof of this woman's capabilities, and at the footage still playing on the screens. Rostova sighed, then tapped a sequence on her wrist device. Immediately, the Emperor's floating throne shuddered and descended several meters. The ancient technologies that had kept it aloft for centuries faltered, leaving it hovering unsteadily just a meter above the floor. That was just a local demonstration, she said calmly. Shall I continue? The Emperor's face had drained of color. What have you done? What is this silence protocol? Rostova paced slowly around Valerius's prone form, addressing not just the Emperor, but the entire assembly. For decades, the Terran colonies have been studying the ancient technologies that form the backbone of hegemony power. Technologies you yourselves no longer fully understand, having simply inherited them from previous generations. We discovered certain vulnerabilities in the fundamental logic architecture of these systems. She paused, allowing her words to register. Rather than building weapons to destroy your ships or kill your soldiers, we developed what we call the Silence Protocol, a cascading logic bomb that progressively shuts down every military and infrastructure network in the hegemony without causing physical harm. No bloodshed, no destruction, just silence for the machinery of oppression. The implications washed over the assembly in waves. The hegemony's power had always rested on technological superiority, technologies so advanced that many subject worlds viewed them as practically magical. The suggestion that these systems had vulnerabilities, and worse, that the supposedly inferior Terrans had discovered how to exploit them, was paradigm shifting. What we've implemented so far is merely Phase 1, Rostova continued. Localized, targeted, and reversible. But at this moment, Phase 2 is being deployed across the Sagittarius and Perseus arms, systematically disabling Imperial control. If I don't prevent it, Phase 3 will cascade through the entire hegemony within days. She withdrew a data crystal from her pocket and held it up for all to see. I have here a proposal for a new galactic charter, one that transforms the hegemony into a true federation of equal worlds. It guarantees autonomy, fair resource allocation, and protection from exploitation. It maintains common defense and trade networks, but distributes power rather than concentrating it. The Emperor's voice had lost its commanding resonance. You expect me to simply surrender centuries of imperial authority because of your threats? The hegemony has weathered rebellions before. This technological terrorism will be overcome. Perhaps, Rostova conceded. Given enough time, your scientists might find countermeasures. But by then, your empire will have already collapsed from within. The Silence Protocol isn't just disabling your technology, it's enabling communication and organization among your subject worlds. They're already rising up, not with weapons, but with the simple knowledge that you're no longer all-powerful. She glanced around the chamber, making eye contact with representatives from various subjugated worlds. The choice is stability through reform or chaos through resistance. There is no return to the status quo. The emperor's throne continued its erratic hovering, occasionally dropping several centimeters before stabilizing, a visceral demonstration of the precariousness of his position. His next words emerged as a near whisper, audible only because of the chamber's perfect acoustics. "I will not be dictated to by Terran upstarts. Guards, Caesar regardless of consequences." Perhaps it was the uncharacteristic quaver in his voice, or perhaps it was the continued evidence of Terran capabilities playing across the screens, but the Imperial Guards remained frozen in indecision. In the vacuum of their hesitation, Rostova made her move. With surprising swiftness for someone bearing recent injuries, she ascended the few steps to the now lowered Imperial throne. Before anyone could react, she had physically grabbed the Emperor himself, the supposedly untouchable, divine embodiment of hegemony power, by his ornate collar. A collective gasp echoed through the chamber as she pulled the ancient ruler from his throne. The Emperor, whose frail physical form had been obscured by ceremonial robes and the grandeur of his elevated position, now dangled like a puppet in Rostova's grip. His feet, in their jeweled ceremonial shoes, barely brushed the ground as she held him partially aloft. "This is your empire," she announced to the stunned assembly, giving the Emperor a slight shake. A withered old man who hides behind pomp and threats, sustained by technologies he doesn't understand, ruling worlds he's never visited. Then, in a move so symbolically powerful it seemed choreographed, she began dragging Emperor Kalen IV across the vast floor of the conclave chamber, just as she had dragged Governor Valerius minutes before. The Emperor's ornate robes swept across the polished obsidian surface, his feeble struggles making the humiliation all the more profound. The assembled delegates watched in absolute silence. No one moved to intervene. The guards stood paralyzed, caught between conflicting impulses of duty and self-preservation. The Emperor's protest became increasingly desperate as Rostova inexorably pulled him toward the main exit, his dignity in tatters, his mystique of invincibility shattered beyond repair. The symbolism of the moment was overwhelming. In one bold stroke, Rostova had transformed the Emperor from a godlike figure to a frail, struggling old man. The physical act of dragging him across the chamber floor, the ultimate desecration of his sacred person, was being transmitted across the galaxy to every world where the conclave proceedings were viewed. I recall thinking in that moment that regardless of what happened next, the hegemony as it had existed for centuries was irrevocably changed. Power built on fear and perceived invulnerability cannot survive such public humiliation. Even if the Terran rebellion were crushed the next day, the image of Emperor Kalen being dragged helplessly across his own conclave floor would remain indelibly imprinted in the collective consciousness of 1,000 worlds. As Rostova reached the massive doorway with her royal captive, she paused to address the assembly one final time. The age of unquestioned hegemony rule is over. What replaces it is up to all of us. I suggest you prepare for negotiation rather than conflict. Then she was gone, taking the Emperor with her and leaving Governor Valerius sprawled unconscious on the chamber floor. Twin symbols of imperial might, both utterly defeated by a single, determined Terran. The silence that followed was like the vacuum of space itself, absolute and suffocating. Within hours, the conclave chamber had been transformed into an improvised crisis center. The Emperor, now under what the Terrans diplomatically termed protective custody, had been installed as private quarters under guard. Rostova and a hastily assembled Terran delegation occupied one wing of the Imperial Palace, while representatives from various sectors huddled in urgent consultation. I found myself unexpectedly thrust into a mediator's role, my Xylosian neutrality suddenly a valuable commodity in a galaxy where traditional power structures were dissolving by the hour. Initial reports from across the hegemony confirmed Rostova's claims. Imperial military and administrative systems were failing in cascading waves. Some regional commanders attempted armed responses, only to find their ships and weapons mysteriously inoperative at critical moments. Others, sensing the shifting winds, declared independence or pledged allegiance to emerging coalitions. Most significantly, communications channels long suppressed by imperial censors sprang to life across formerly isolated worlds. Ideas and information flowed freely for the first time in generations. Whereas previous rebellions had been isolated and easily contained, this one was characterized by unprecedented coordination and shared purpose. 3 days after what was already being called the dragging, a term that would echo through historical accounts for centuries to come, I was present at the first formal negotiation session between Rostova's Terran delegation and representatives from key hegemony power centers. The Emperor himself was also present, though the transformation in his demeanor was striking. Stripped of his ceremonial regalia and seated in a simple chair rather than his technological throne, he appeared shrunken and diminished. His expression alternated between seething resentment and vacant resignation as the proceedings unfolded. Rostova, by contrast, had abandoned her military demeanor for a more diplomatic approach. Now dressed in formal civilian attire, her injuries treated but still visible, she projected calm authority. When she spoke, her voice no longer carried the edge of confrontation that had characterized her dramatic entrance. The silence protocol remains active but contained, she explained to the assembled delegates. Its effects are being carefully managed to maintain essential civilian services while continuing to neutralize military capacity. It will be fully deactivated when a new galactic charter is ratified. And we are simply to trust in Terran benevolence, demanded the representative from Centauri Prime, a core world whose prosperity had been built on centuries of preferential treatment under Imperial rule. Your technological assault could be the prelude to your own bid for domination. Rostova's response was measured. If domination were our goal, we would have chosen a different strategy. The silence protocol doesn't transfer control to us. It simply nullifies centralized control altogether. What we're proposing is genuinely distributed governance. I observed the skepticism on many faces begin to waver as Rostova outlined the Terran proposal. The draft charter she presented would transform the rigid hegemony into a looser federation, with guaranteed rights of planetary self-determination, protections for indigenous cultures and ecosystems, and mechanisms for equitable resource sharing. Most revolutionary was the proposed governance structure, a council with rotating membership and built-in checks against power concentration. The Emperor, who had been silent throughout the initial presentations, finally spoke. His voice, without its artificial amplification, sounded thin and brittle. This federation you propose, what role do you envision for the imperial throne? There was a collective intake of breath. The question that had been foremost in many minds, yet which protocol had forbidden articulating, had been voiced by the Emperor himself. Rostova met his gaze directly. A constitutional role, Your Majesty. The continuity of the imperial office would be maintained as a unifying symbol and ceremonial position. But legislative, judicial, and executive functions would be distributed among the council, the courts, and the administrative branches. The Emperor's laugh was hollow. A figurehead, then, a puppet to legitimize your revolution. A symbol of transition rather than rupture, Rostova corrected gently. And a recognition that even as systems change, cultural continuity has value. The negotiations proceeded for 10 grueling days. I watched as initial positions softened, as unlikely alliances formed, as the practical realities of a post-hegemony galaxy began to take shape in the draft accords. The Terrans proved surprisingly flexible on many points, yielding on matters of procedure and symbolism while remaining firm on fundamental principles of autonomy and equity. Throughout the process, the silence protocol remained the unspoken leverage point. Its continued operation, the progressive expansion of technological silence across imperial systems, created urgency that overcame traditional diplomatic inertia. Yet its bloodless nature allowed for negotiation without the bitter resentments that typically follow violent conflict. On the 11th day, The emperor, after hours of private consultation with his remaining loyal advisors, formally accepted the framework of what would be called the Cygnus Accords. His capitulation was not gracious. His statement was terse and laced with implied threats about the dangers of rapid change. But it was final. As the delegates filed out of the chamber following this historic announcement, I found myself walking alongside Rostova. The weight of recent events showed in the shadows beneath her eyes, but there was quiet satisfaction in her bearing. "Your gamble paid off," I observed, speaking as Loris Vanya rather than as the Zylosian ambassador. "Though I confess, when I saw you drag the emperor across the floor, I thought you'd overplayed your hand." That level of humiliation often breeds intractable resistance. Rostova nodded thoughtfully. It was calculated, not impulsive. Our behavioral psychologists and cultural anthropologists spent months analyzing imperial power structures. They concluded that the hegemony's control was based primarily on perceived invulnerability and divine right. Both needed to be shattered simultaneously and publicly. And the silence protocol? Was that truly as extensive as you claimed? Her smile was enigmatic. Extensive enough. Let's leave it at that. The formal signing of the Cygnus Accords took place 3 weeks later in the same conclave chamber where the dragging had occurred. The symbolism was intentional, a reclaiming of space, a continuity amid transformation. The chamber itself had been subtly modified, with the concentric rings of seating rearranged to reduce hierarchical distinctions. The emperor's throne, restored to functionality but significantly lowered, now stood level with the council seats rather than floating above them. Emperor Kalen IV performed his ceremonial role with dignified resignation. As he affixed his seal to the Accords, officially transforming the galactic hegemony into the federated systems, I detected in his ancient eyes a complex emotion, perhaps the recognition that his legacy would not be one of continued dominance, but of adaptation that ensured at least some form of survival for the institution he embodied. One by one, representatives from across the galaxy added their signatures or equivalent marks of assent. The Terran delegation, led by Rostova, was neither first nor last, simply one delegation among many, though their role in precipitating these changes was acknowledged in the preamble to the document itself. As the ceremony concluded and the newly constituted Federal Council prepared for its inaugural session, I found a moment of quiet to record my personal observations, reflections that would later form part of the official Zylosian diplomatic archive. The galaxy that emerged from the signing of the Cygnus Accords was fundamentally altered. Traditional power centers were diminished, while formerly marginalized worlds found new voice. Economic relationships that had been exploitative for centuries were being cautiously renegotiated. Cultural exchanges flourished in the absence of imperial censorship. Yet significant challenges loomed. Power vacuums in the former imperial territories led to regional conflicts. Opportunistic factions attempted to establish new hegemonies. The dismantling of the Silence Protocol, a precondition for full implementation of the Accords, proceeded in fits and starts as trust slowly built. Most profound was the psychological adjustment required of a galaxy that had known only imperial rule for generations. Freedom, it turned out, was as disorienting as it was exhilarating. Many worlds struggled with self-governance after centuries of external control. Others embraced autonomy with destabilizing enthusiasm. The final public session of the transitional period featured an address by Captain Eva Rostova, who would soon return to Terran space as their representative to the new Federal Council. Her words, broadcast across a galaxy still coming to terms with its transformed reality, were characteristically direct. "We have begun something unprecedented," she told the assembled delegates and the countless billions watching via transmission. "Not the replacement of one empire with another, but a genuine attempt at distributed governance on a galactic scale. It will be messy. It will sometimes seem chaotic compared to the rigid order of the hegemony. There will be those who long for the certainty of imperial decree rather than the complexity of collective decision-making." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the chamber. but if we maintain our commitment to the principles enshrined in the Accords, autonomy balanced with cooperation, diversity within unity, power distributed rather than concentrated, we have the opportunity to build something far more resilient and just than the hegemony ever was. As Rostova concluded her address, my attention was drawn to the former emperor, now the constitutional sovereign. He watched her with an expression I found difficult to interpret, something between grudging respect and lingering resentment. When their eyes met briefly across the chamber, there passed between them a moment of acknowledgement, adversaries whose conflict had reshaped a galaxy. In that moment, I reflected on the extraordinary sequence of events that had led to this juncture. How one determined individual, through a combination of technological insight and psychological calculation, had toppled an empire not through superior firepower or mass bloodshed, but through the simple, shocking act of dragging its emperor across the floor of his own conclave. The galaxy was no longer silent. It resonated with countless voices newly empowered to speak. And while the harmony they created was sometimes discordant, it contained within it possibilities that centuries of imperial monotone had never permitted. The image that would define this turning point in galactic history remained indelible. Not fleets in combat or worlds in flames, but a lone Terran dragging a supposedly divine emperor across a polished floor, shattering in one symbolic gesture the illusion of invulnerability upon which his power had rested. Sometimes, I mused as the session concluded and the delegates dispersed toward an uncertain future. The most profound revolutions begin not with thunderous declarations, but with the simple, ruthless exposure of power's fundamental fragility.